listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my wingman, Bob Schlehuber. Let's get ready to go against the grain. First, happy belated Memorial Day. This will be a short week, but we're going to start this week off with a bang. So we're going to start talking about Joe Biden stating his fervent belief in unbelievable things in conjunction with the tortured framing of liberals in their gimp suits trying to cajole, con, and to shame progressive or, for that matter, disaffected voters into pulling the lever for one random blue, in this specific case, one Joe Biden. If you're a person that cares about policy over party, you will want to stay for this segment. I'm going to arm you with what you need to know for the upcoming election. A little later, we'll discuss the successful delivery of Iranian oil to Venezuela in the face of overt belligerence by the United States government. Both countries have been under sanctions and concerted propaganda campaigns to justify the sadistic behavior. Bill Clinton's sanctions on Iraq killed 500,000 kids in that country because they couldn't import the necessary medications to deal with the most basic of medical issues. What do you think these sanctions are doing in Venezuela and Iran? Or for that matter, Syria, where Trump gave the order to destroy, to steal the oil and basically to destroy their wheat crops. Has the realization ever dawned on you that perhaps we are not the good guys in this story? Next, states are reopening. Yay! Considering it has been decades since reality has been regarded as an impediment to our political parties' magical thinking, we shouldn't be surprised that the United States government is prioritizing cash and the interests of the owner class over that of public health. In a rational world, the statement that I just made would be considered outrageous. This, however, is not a rational world, and the population's expectations have been so deadened. What I just said about basically prioritizing the interests of the owner class or the interests of cash over that of human beings would just be considered normal. We're going to step into the current COVID numbers and discuss the uproar over a comment made by the Trump advisor regarding human beings as human capital stock. So basically, the issue is not that the owner class views you as entirely a means to an end in their stupid human trick in order to generate additional profit. The issue is that they said it aloud. Great. In the second hour, we'll keep this momentum going with a dive into the propaganda war against China and whether or not the Trump administration is winning that propaganda war. There are also geopolitical consequences that go beyond the two belligerent nations into policy on North Korea and the inability to turn the corner on the Korean War. Are the escalations and tensions between the United States and North Korea related to basically the failing relationship between the United States and China? We're also going to discuss the pushback against globalization in the beating heart of Europe, Germany. Last but not least, it is Tuesday. That means the most cultured segment on the network, the politics of art. We have a prodigious segment for you today. We'll have activist and artist Eleanor Goldfield discuss her new movie on West Virginia coal country. But let's start here. There was big news over the weekend. Joe Biden has finally emerged from his basement, decked out in a suit and a matching black mask that covered a majority of his face. Biden surfaced for some political fisticuffs. Now, the AP has run an astonishing story on Biden's fervent belief in unbelievable things. The story is called Biden Aims to Move to the Left Without Abandoning Centrist Roots. I have no idea how you do that. The article dovetails with the utterly bizarre and hand-wringing by liberals over the cash and the quadrennial industrial machinery being revved up by Democrats and gimp suit battered wives of the left looking for an excuse to get those people to pull the lever for one Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden gave an interview to CNBC where he quadrupled down on the sincerity of not being for Medicare for all, but believing that healthcare is indeed a human right. If you're backing a policy that will perpetuate our current cluster toilet sex healthcare system, then you can't tell me that you're for universal healthcare. Let's hear the clip.
Look at my record. The fact is that some areas that I think, for example, I think healthcare is a right, not a privilege. I do not support Medicare for all. I will not support Medicare for all, but I do support making sure that Obamacare is around with a public option for those who can't afford, those who qualify for Medicaid and they don't get in their state, they would be able to be automatically be enrolled in the public option of Medicare. But I do not support a, forgiving debt loan for every single solitary person, no matter where he went to school.
At that point, Joe Biden transitioned into basically talking about school, seamless transition that confused me in the moment. It took a little bit later to explain. Basically, yes, I'm going to continue fracking. I'm going to continue the subsidies for oil and gas, but I also believe the scientists when they tell me the world will end if we continue on this path of behavior. I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. This is believing in unbelievable things, as if your belief is somehow entirely disconnected and untethered to the policy that you're espousing regarding that particular belief. Around the same time, the Wall Street Journal lamented on the quote-unquote elusiveness of the Bernie Sanders coalition and donating to one Joe Biden. Reports show a whopping 3% of Bernie voters have donated to Joe Biden. I'm shocked by that. I can't believe it's even that high. 3%. How deadened do you have to be inside to be a Sanders supporter that is supporting all of these policies, and then you're willing to give money, not just having to wash or take a shower after making your vote, but actually give money to that same one Joe Biden. The reality of it is that the Democratic Party backs Medicare for all to the tune of 88%. The Democratic Party backs the elimination of student debt to the tune of over 70-something%. And you get, of course, the various numbers that are over 50%, even in states that backed Biden to the tune of over 30 points, like in South Carolina or in other of these southern states. All of these states were for Medicare for all. All of these guys were for the elimination of student debt. And if you expand it beyond the Democratic Party, you still have a majority on all of those policy ideas. Yes, they want a Green New Deal. Yes, they want to expand jobs. Yes, they want higher wages. Yes, they want to get rid of student debt. Yes, they also want Medicare for all, again, to the tune of 88% or to the tune of 70% if you're talking about the rest of the population. And despite all of that, despite all of these people who are part of that particular party that want that particular policy or those policy priorities, Joe Biden is against it. Nail that down. A policy that pulls in 88% support, near unanimity in regards to support. Joe Biden is like, I'm not against that. I'm not for that at all. I'm against that. I'm against that. And has been continuously saying, I am against this very specific policies that 88% of Democrats support and this other one that over 70% Democrats support. And then he would turn around and say, but I'm going to be this kind of progressive centrist without giving up my roots. I'm sorry. That is not being a progressive centrist. That's just being a centrist. There's a difference in those things. The fact of the matter is, if you're a Sanders voter, if you're a Bernie voter, you have two main problems here. One is the framing. The framing is utterly and entirely bizarre. A policy that has 88% Democratic support. What Joe Biden and what all of these other people who are in their gimp suits, who are trying to get lefties like myself and all of these other people who are not Democrats to vote for the Democrat, you need to explain and justify to me, how does a Democratic president turn down and revoke a policy that has 88% Democratic support and say it is more important that we don't pass this policy that has near unanimity in regards to support as opposed to beating Trump? Meaning we would rather lose to Trump than accept a policy that has 88% Democratic support and 70% Democratic support. That's mind-blowing. That's utterly mind-blowing. You have an odd situation across the board in regards to these policies. But all of these people will still look you in the face and say, you should vote for Joe Biden, blue no matter who. Missing the point that if Donald Trump is really the apocalypse, if Donald Trump is really going to eat babies and kick puppies, if Donald Trump is really going to be the end of the world because of his climate change or revolutionize democracy going forward where he just destroys democracy, if indeed you believe that, and if indeed you are telling me that, then you have somewhat of a problem to justify how come the Democratic Party and Joe Biden is not willing to unify the party in an organic way by accepting a policy that has 88% support. I could go down the list. Do your job. That's what this boils down to. Do your job. Don't come to me and tell me that I should back this guy who's not willing to back a policy that the overwhelming majority of the party supports. You basically told me that your political instrument is entirely decapitated from what the public wants, but that I should still continue to back that. That's insane. On the second part, even if Joe Biden did accept it, you have to deal with the fact that a rabid liar is basically telling you whatever you need to hear in order to get into office. A man that was literally kicked out the presidential race in the 80s for lying and being part of the civil rights movement, lying about his education credentials, lying and plagiarizing speeches. Clearly, there was no remorse in this level of lying because in this term, in 2020, he recycled the lie that he apologized for in the 80s. He didn't end up with Mandela. He didn't get locked up in South Africa. There wasn't a situation where he wasn't pushing to get rid of Social Security or undermining Social Security. In one policy after the next, Joe Biden flagrantly, outright, without any remorse at all, just lied. How sacred is the civil rights movement and his willingness to basically lie for political expedience? So, two main problems. A, you can't trust them in the first place. And B, this notion of radical centrism is absurd. Bob, how do they justify? I got to be honest, I don't understand how the Democratic Party and Biden justifies basically saying Donald Trump is going to end the world. However, we're willing to lose to Donald Trump if it means stopping your policy that has 88% support. How bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Jamal, I've told you this the last few months here. Well, welcome to the Democratic Party. I mean, this is the Democratic Party. We shouldn't be surprised at this point because they're pretty consistent with what they do. A few just notes on what you said. It's fascinating that Joe Biden can come out here and basically clamor to protect the insurance companies and big pharma. Nobody ever asked how he's going to pay for this kind of pseudo half free, half not free. Some people pay, they don't pay. We cover the rest of the expenses. It simply does not work unless you share the cost amongst the wealthiest and the poorest, in my opinion, around healthcare costs. And yet nobody asked him, how are you going to pay for it? Bernie Sanders basically comes up with the plan, lays it all out there, explains how he's going to pay for it. And the number one question they constantly throw at him, well, how are you going to pay for it, Bernie? So it's amazing to me that you just kind of get the Democratic Party and the mainline people like Joe Biden just get a complete pass on any of their plans on how they're going to pay for it. And of course, they can't actually pay for it. None of it's ever going to go through. They're going to say we try to reach across the aisle and we didn't get it done. So they're kind of protected in many ways from these policies eventually failing because they can always just blame the Republican Party. It's lip service. That 3% number I thought was really interesting, Jamal, of 3% of Bernie Sanders donors. You just say Bernie Sanders had 1 million voters, 33,000 have now donated to Biden. I thought the number would be higher. I
Really?
do think a lot of people that still supported Bernie Sanders are mainline Democratic people. Or at the end of the day, they want to work within a spectrum of the Democratic Party, but they don't want to abandon it writ large. And so 3% is a large alarm that must be ringing in Joe Biden's camp right now, saying how in the hell do we address that? Because they're going to be at a huge financial disadvantage against Donald Trump. And so they desperately need that money. And then beyond that, I guess my last point, Jamal, I think these politicians are proxies for the culture of our society,
Yes,
and people project onto them what they see and they value themselves. And being a liar and honesty clearly in America right now is not a problem for a lot of Americans. That simply just doesn't repeal them. They say, hey, it's America. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It's hard out there for folks, but we got to fight regardless if it's honest or not. And that's a really sad state of affairs. And so beyond Biden, I think it says quite a bit about the state of the United States. Jamal, we do need to take our first break of the hour, but I do want to note that just before our show went to air today, that the Minneapolis Police Department identified George Floyd as the man that was killed by one of their officers on Monday. Floyd was originally stopped on suspicion of forgery, and somehow it escalated quickly in a video that is now rapidly circulating the internet. A police officer has Floyd on the ground and his knee on the neck of Floyd. Floyd can then be heard saying, I can't breathe, until eventually Floyd loses consciousness and eventually is pronounced dead. The Minneapolis police are calling the death a, quote, medical incident, while Minneapolis Mayor Melvin Carter wrote today on Twitter, quote, the video of a Minneapolis police officer killing a defenseless, handcuffed man is one of the most vile and heartbreaking images I've ever seen. The officer who stood guard is just as responsible as his partner. Both must be held fully accountable. This must stop. Now, we will surely, Jamal, hear more about this story as the week goes on, but we just wanted to mention that George Floyd, they're killed in Minneapolis in a video that is making the rounds on the internet quickly. We'll talk about that and much more throughout our show today. In the first hour, we will shift gears and talk about Iran sending a large oil shipment to Venezuela, Sweden's inability to reach herd immunity, and we talk about what exactly a Trump economic advisor meant when he called U.S. workers, quote, human capital stock. Yep, another day in America. If that's not enough, don't worry, Misfits. We have a second hour for you after that. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, the indefatigable Bob Schlehuber. I love that word. If you guys are
using the GRE words today, I love it.
GRE words.
I'm like, I got to look up these words as we go along here tomorrow.
Well, I saw the Munchausen one that you guys were back and forth about. If you guys are digging what we're putting down, certainly like and share and subscribe to this channel. Also, engagement is amply appreciated, and it helps this show be what it is. You can always reach us by chat, tweets, and of course, by phone, 202-521-1320. So, over the weekend, something significant happened in geopolitics. The United States hasn't let the 100,000 dead Americans and our country's inability to secure medical supplies and financial assistance to the population stop their sadism in murdering as many people as possible with their sanctions, or with our sanctions. If you guys, as a flat fact, if you are taking a policy that is clear, that is a clear, predictable outcome, then you can't call it an accident and you can't call it unintentional. Let's stop pretending that a choice made in the White House doesn't have repercussions in the larger, wider world. That's true of Obama's failed effort at regime change in Syria that wiped out 500,000 Syrians. And that's also true currently of Donald Trump and his sanction regime that is basically depriving these various countries of their ability to get medication or, in Venezuela's case, oil. Two countries under U.S. sanctions, Iran and Venezuela, came together over the weekend in deepening ties with the two countries basically negotiating oil for gold. Iran has oil, Venezuela has gold. Both of them need the other. And in this very specific case, Iranian ships basically brought that oil to Venezuelan shores. The Fortune, an Iranian tanker, sailed into Venezuela harbor over the weekend, delivering desperately needed oil to the country with the largest oil reserves in the world. The Fortune will be one of 5 ships that will be making the journey to deliver their cargo. Now, as I said before, Iran desperately needs the cash, Venezuela desperately needs the oil, and both of them are looking for ways to ensure or secure their nation against U.S. hegemony. Joining us to discuss is Kevin Zeese, a co-director of Popular Resistance, which just put out a newsletter on this very interesting topic. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Good to talk to you again.
Absolutely. So, on the first successful voyage, Venezuela's elected president, Nicolas Maduro, tweeted, "The end of Ramadan brings us the arrival of the Fortune ship, a sign that the solidarity of the Islamic people of Iran with Venezuela. In times where the supremacist empire seeks to impose its rule by force, only the brotherhood of free people will save us." Now, to some degree, this is, I read your article, and your article made the point that this is a triumph for issues of liberty, freedom, dignity, these type of issues. Explain why you say that.
Well, these 5 tankers are coming from a country that has faced long-term economic sanctions ever since they threw out U.S. puppet the Shah of Iran, been attacked economically and with threat with military attack by the United States. Venezuela, ever since they threw out the previous government and brought in Hugo Chavez and broke from U.S. empire, has also been under attack by the United States. And economic sanctions began with George Bush, escalated under Obama, and more under Trump. So these are 2 of the most sanctioned and attacked countries in the world by the United States. And for them to come together, overcome the United States, the victory. Now, prior to these ships getting through, so far 2 ships have gotten through of the 5. Prior to them getting through, President Trump had used very aggressive language, saying that they had the country surrounded with the U.S. Navy and the Air Force. There were anonymous quotes from Elliot Abrams. I'm just guessing Elliot Abrams, of course. He's in charge of Venezuela policy for Trump. Adding more threats, and so there was a concern that we could see a real conflict. And Venezuela and Iran did not back down. They went to the UN. They made their own. Said that they'd respond aggressively. Venezuela said its Navy would accompany the ships into port. They entered international waters, and these ships came through. The Venezuelan Navy escorted them. Before one is made to port and one is being escorted, and 3 others are on the way. And this is just a sign that if countries stand together, the economic sanctions, these illegal, unilateral, coercive measures can be overcome. 39 countries now sanctioned by the United States illegally.
That's
These
astonishing.
countries stood together.
Yeah, that's astonishing.
One-
At a certain point, you've just isolated yourself in doing all of these sanctions. I'm sorry. Please continue.
That's exactly right. The U.S. is overdoing this sanction abuse, and that is creating the U.S. being isolated. If these countries unite together, they include big countries. Russia and China are involved in this as well. They include, these countries unite together, they can overcome these sanctions. And Europe wants to be, if these countries say we're not going to trade with Europe, let's say ignore U.S. sanctions, Europe's going to go with the biggest economies in the world coming together outside the United States. China is the engine of the global economy. Their Belt and Road Initiative will determine the 21st century economy. So Europe can't turn its back on these sanctioned countries. So I think Iran and Venezuela have shown the path, and I hope other countries will follow.
I agree with you on this. And just to give context to the belligerence that was being displayed by Trump in the U.S. So this was come from your article. President Trump told a conservative audience, Popular Resistance article, President Trump told a conservative audience that the United States has Venezuela surrounded. Earlier this year, Trump ordered a U.S. Armada to the Caribbean to target Venezuela, including destroyers, littoral combat ships, Poseidon maritime planes, AWAC surveillance aircraft, and on-the-ground special forces units. This is the largest U.S. military presence in the region since 1989 invasion of Panama. We have another one where anonymous White House official told Reuters that the United States has been, quote unquote, looking at measures that can be taken to stop the unwelcome impending delivery. The Washington Post quoted an unnamed high-level Trump official saying the administration, quote unquote, would not abide Iran's support for Maduro, and the president has made clear the United States will not tolerate continued meddling in supporters of an illegitimate regime. That's amazing. Now, I find that to be amazing because basically we're saying sovereign countries can't interact with other sovereign countries because the United States says so. That's astonishing, right? So that just gives more context. I'm curious, with all this belligerence, why do you believe that Trump didn't try to do a trade embargo, meaning put those ships in, kind of like during World War II where they said we're not going to allow Russians or the Soviet Union put the missiles into Cuba? Why didn't they go that far in this? Is it just the coronavirus had taken up so much attention and time, or was it one of those things where Donald Trump wasn't crazy enough to basically start a war, which is basically what he would have started if he would have tried to do that?
First off, just think about that armada that you described. These 5 tankers are going right by this threatening armada. It's an embarrassment to the United States. They're spending tens of millions of dollars to keep these ships, these AWAC planes, and other aircraft, all this personnel in the Caribbean. This is a multi-tens of $million expenditure for what? And the reason they didn't respond was because of many reasons. Well, one, Iran has a great ability to respond to the United States in the Persian Gulf and Middle East region. It's a Hormuz, lots of targets for Iran. After the United States assassinated General Soleimani, I'm sure the U.S. went through a lot of review of the potential targets. Iran prepared to look at various targets, and then they responded very in kind, to hit the air bases where the attack on the murder of Soleimani came from. Now, if they block a tanker, U.S. knows all these targets are out there. And so not only are you having a potential problem in the Latin American and the Caribbean, where Venezuela has a very serious, been preparing their military for years because Trump has been talking about a military attack since 2017. They've built a massive civilian militia of more than 3 million. They have a military of 200,000 plus a National Guard and a national police force. They are ready for the U.S. to take military action. And they also have the allies with Russia and China. Russia's provided them with missiles to defend against a missile attack. And so Israel's prepared. So you have both Latin America and the Middle East, areas where the U.S. could be responded to if they took action. So this would have been a tremendous defeat for the United States. This was a lose-lose situation for the U.S. and a win-win for Venezuela and Iran. A win-win because either the U.S. would back down, Iran and Venezuela win, or the U.S. would go into a quagmire mistake that would dramatically hurt the United States. It would not be good for Venezuela as well to be denied this essential fuel at this critical time, but it would be a lose-lose for the United States, not just with Venezuela around, but the world would say, middle of a coronavirus, preventing essential fuel, people can't get to the hospital. I mean, the backlash of the world would have been incredible, in addition to the ability of Iran, Venezuela, and its allies to respond.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm curious if the backlash would have been the same here in the United States. Obviously, us Americans don't really care or pay much attention to global interest or where people are thinking about our country abroad. Obviously, we have no shame towards our actions, but I wonder if that blowback would be the same. It seems like Donald Trump's calculus with a lot of this foreign policy is thoughtful when it comes to, well, what do the American people really have an appetite to pay attention to? Do they want to see Kim Jong-un in North Korea? Sure, that looks good. Do they want a full-blown war? Probably not. Do they mind if I talk and put pressure and sanctions against Iran and Venezuela? Yeah, we don't mind that. If it comes to full-blown war, probably not going to go that far. So it seems like Trump has been calculated in kind of where he picks and chooses his battles. I don't think he's winning any of them. I don't really understand where it's gotten us. But at the end of the day, I think about people in certain places that don't know much about what happened in Venezuela, especially as you guys all occupied the embassy. And enough of the message got to people, though, that something was wrong with Maduro. Maduro's either a dictator or authoritarian, or something's kind of bad with him. And that's as far as the American populace really showed interest in that topic. And so it seems like Trump is calculated in a way not to stir the masses in the United States, but to do it in a way that gets his point across without kind of going too far. And I don't think he's like a crazy genius and he's calculated this out, but I think he has some kind of risk analysis where he's not going to push so far, but he'll push certain buttons that he can get away with.
I think this is all very calculated, and it's all calculated around the 2020 election, usually when it comes to Venezuela, around Florida and the anti-Cuban, anti-socialist views of the left, Florida, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and other Latin American countries that have moved to the left, and that makes it a large Florida population now. It's interesting that Joe Biden has also said he would not change the Trump foreign policy on Venezuela. Of course not, because the Trump policy is the same, is building on the Obama policy, which built on the Bush policy. So this is a bipartisan thing. But yes, he's very calculated. And I think the backlash, though, has more risk than just, the UN saying, or Security Council having a meeting and criticizing the United States. What's happening on a gradual basis is more and more countries are uniting against the United States, and particularly around economic issues. They are forming alternative ways to do trade with each other the United States out. And one thing Trump understands, I think, is trade is important for the United States as far as economic domination and economic growth. And if the United States gets starting to get cut out of trade deals because of their sanctions, which is starting to happen, that is going to undermine the economy at a time when we're going through economic collapse like none we've ever seen before, greater than the Great Depression of the 1930s. He can't afford that risk. So at this point, if the U.S. overplays its hand, not only will there be blowback politically around the world, but there'll be blowback economically. An election year, economics dominates. Economics will right now, Florida is moving toward a Biden state, which is a surprise. And it's because of the economy and COVID. And so he couldn't afford to risk an economic blowback from the world. Once these countries start uniting against the U.S., it's going to undermine the U.S. Global economic reality.
You know, I'm curious, when we're talking about the various political situations, I mean, because I think you're right. If Donald Trump would have put those ships out there, it was out of his hands. I mean, if indeed one of those ships fired on us, or if one of the U.S. ships were fired upon, the idea that we could withdraw from that situation just doesn't seem to be on the table. So I totally get where you're coming from with this. I'm curious, though, what's the political climate in these various countries that deal with this? Like, for example, right now you have Venezuela, you have Iran. Both of these countries are under a certain amount of pressure. Now, you have Trump, who basically pulled out of the JCPOA right off the bat as soon as he more or less got into office. He had the intentions against the JCPOA from jump. Trump almost started a war in Iran when he killed Soleimani. And you have this situation where Trump could have legitimately started a war here if he would have tried to intercept those ships. I'm curious, what are the political situations in the countries themselves in engaging this crisis of sorts? I mean, because basically Venezuela and Iran, I agree that it may be disastrous from the standpoint of our economy, but it would also be somewhat potentially disastrous for the countries in regards to human health. So how does the political climate in these various countries deal with this kind of provocative actions of the United States juxtaposed against those countries trying to forge deeper ties and a deeper relationship between one another?
Great question. I think it's really interesting. One of the unintended consequences of these illegal unilateral coercive measures, this economic war against Iran and Venezuela, as well as the escalating military threats, and in Venezuela's case, regime change of it with the puppet Guaido. One of the unintended consequences is uniting people around their leadership. Both leadership have their faults because they're dealing with very difficult problems, and those faults are being pushed down, putting up in U.S. imperialism first. When we were in Venezuela, we met with people who were critics of President Maduro from a perspective of the left. They said that we're not going to criticize Maduro now because more important is to keep the United States out. Independence, our sovereignty, that comes first. The same is true in Iran. A lot of criticism of the religious leaders in Iran, autocracy, and but the people are suppressing that and focusing instead on national unity to the United States. And so in Venezuela, they have upcoming this year elections for their National Assembly. Now, earlier this year, Juan Guaido, who had been the president of the National Assembly, was defeated in his re-election for that post. The opposition is now divided. They see a lot of corruption around Juan Guaido, the U.S. puppet, and the National Assembly no longer is in control by the opposition, but not the Juan Guaido opposition. Now, these assembly elections coming up will be a very interesting measure of success. Now, already the United States has looked at the future and has said to their allies in Venezuela, boycott the election. Let's make this election illegitimate. We're not going to win, so boycott the election. They did the same thing when Maduro ran for office, re-election a couple of years ago. I was there for that election, and the U.S. again tried to get Venezuelans to boycott, tried to get candidates not to run against Maduro. There were 5 candidates in the race. Maduro won 67% of the vote. About half the population voted. So that failed, that approach. But the U.S. effort was to delegitimize an illegitimate election even before the election starts, and they're trying to do the same thing in the National Assembly because it's very likely that the Maduro's political party and its allies, it's a multi-party country, will win the majority of the National Assembly in these upcoming elections. So I think it's actually having the reverse effect. It's strengthening. Now, on the other hand, both countries are feeling incredible economic stress. It's not an easy situation. Both countries, though, have educated their population to make it clear who to blame. When Juan Guaido calls for more sanctions or calls for military intervention, that undermines Juan Guaido and the United States and strengthens Maduro. So while there's a lot of economic challenges in both countries, people know the source of the challenge is the economic war driven by the United States and those puppets in the countries who are allied with the United States.
You know, that puts you in the mind of the Nazi bombing rates, but that Nazis thought that if they bombed Britain, that the country would basically splinter, and that they will be able to kind of pick up the pieces or to destroy it based on the country just kind of being at each other's throats. And that wasn't the way it ended up happening. What ended up happening was the country came together in a certain degree of solidarity to push back against what they consider to be an outside force. I'm curious, Hassan Rouhani. Rouhani was brought in order to be the moderate, and with this notion that, okay, we need to turn the page from Ahmadinejad, and we need to deal with somebody who is more in line with moderation, that's less hostile, and allowing the ability to even get the JCPOA passed in the first place. With Donald Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, this basically burned the moderates in this race. Are we going to see another election where the political tenor of Iran changes in response to basically the U.S. threats?
No question. We've already seen that. The last elections of their assembly, the conservatives took control. Of course, in Iran, the elections are very much controlled by a council that says who can run and who can't run. And a lot of the moderates or progressives is probably too strong a word, were not allowed to run. So it was a very clear this was going to be more conservative. But Iran does have a democracy, a very flawed democracy. Ours is flawed as well. It's a flawed democracy, and people do vote. Rouhani won an election. When I was in Iran, we met for the peace delegation. We had a meeting with their foreign minister, Zarif, who's a brilliant guy. What really struck me at that meeting, he talked to us about 90 minutes. What really struck me about that was he was very attuned to public opinion. You would think in Iran, public opinion, does that matter? No, it does matter, because they know that a conservative majority can come into play. A whole different tenor of government can take place, the current government. And someone like Zarif may not, even though he's a great foreign minister and has been involved in the leadership of Iran on and off, mostly on, since he was a PhD graduate in the United States. Back in when the revolution happened, he was in charge of the United Nations for Iran. And so Zarif was measuring public opinion. He was saying, when we signed the nuclear agreement, people were joyous. They were in the streets celebrating. They thought the sanctions would be lifted. We'd be, economically better off. And we had 85% support. Now it's down to 55% support for that. And in fact, that day we met with Zarif, that afternoon, he announced his resignation. And he said in his resignation, I've failed the country, and I've not represented it well, and so I'm resigning. The next few days that we were there, you could see the country rallying around Zarif. You could see the Revolutionary Guard, the Rouhani's staff, the Supreme Leader's staff, and Rouhani himself decide he would not accept the resignation. And Zarif's power got stronger because people rallied around him. He had shown incredible dignity, saying he would resign because he hadn't served the country well. Yeah. And he said, we need. I think in the future, we're going to see a much more conservative Iran. And now in Venezuela, I think the opposite. Venezuela is probably going to get more radical as a result of the United States. So it's interesting that two parties are a little bit different that way. Countries a little bit different that way.
Well, Kevin, I appreciate it. We're out of time. With that, we're out of time. Kevin Zeese. Kevin, where can people find more of your work online?
Just check out popularresistance.org. We cover Iran and Venezuela and other countries a great deal. We do a weekly newsletter. The most recent one was on this issue of Iran and Venezuela and the tankers coming to Venezuela. So popularresistance.org.
Very cool, Kevin. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on to the show. With that, we're going to turn to a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Black of the Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. We've been talking about the laughable political theater of Joe Biden as the quote-unquote centrist FDR. Those are my quotes for me. Sound like those good old freedom-loving terrorists that we backed in Libya and Syria. Unfortunately, those two things don't necessarily go together, which is kind of my point. We also got into a rather fascinating conversation regarding the deepening of ties between Iran and Venezuela as Iranian ships deliver shipments of oil in exchange for Venezuelan gold. Give us a call at 202-521-1320 if you have anything to say on these topics, or for that matter, whatever else is on your mind. Keep it PG, please. So over the weekend, the New York Times revealed its own board of shame with a stinging indictment to the failure of the Trump administration, with a full front page listing of nearly 100,000 people who died of the COVID-19 pandemic. To add further context to this, 1.7 million people have been infected in the United States. This is only in the United States. 99,537 have died. Nearly 40 million are without a job, as many as expected to be without their health care. Blacks have died at a rate of 3 times more than whites. 800,000 people are estimated to be homeless as rents come due and as those people are unable to basically pay those rents. And this is also in the context of states like Florida and Georgia being caught lying about their infection rates as they push to open their economy. White House advisor Kevin Hassett, listen to what he says. He made a statement that got a lot of people angry at him. And I have to be honest, the statement itself shouldn't be the thing that makes people angry. It should be the fact that the statement is, for the most part, true. Let's hear the clip, the human capital stock clip.
We don't have, our capital stock hasn't been destroyed. Our human capital stock is ready to get back to work. And so that there are lots of reasons to believe that we can get going way faster than we have in previous crises.
Human capital stock, Bob. I love that. Now, my issue here is that we in this country give biases towards the owner class. If you don't believe me, look at what we've done with the COVID-19 virus. You had a pandemic, and the biggest concern of the Trump administration, and even I would even make the case of Democrats, is how we're going to get these people back to work. They didn't want to ensure that their salaries were okay because, again, you need that vulnerability in order to push those people back into their jobs. They wasn't necessarily worried about the health of those human beings. I mean, even the legislation that these guys were talking about passing was to shield the various companies from liability of bringing somebody in your restaurant if those people ended up getting sick. There is a clear bias that goes to the interests of the owner class, and that bias has been there for the last 40, 50 years. The moment that all accountability left your system, then you lost the ability to hold any of these people accountable for their horrible behavior. The fact of the matter is, this guy, even though you may not like the words, is right. They do look at you as human capital stock. They do look at you as the means to an end of the stupid human trick that allows them to maximize their profit at your expense. So, Bob, when I hear him say this, I just think, okay, he's being honest from the way that this owner class sees the population. But people didn't necessarily like being called out their name like that. It's like, all right, I can deal with you treating me that way. Just don't tell me that you're treating me that way.
Yeah, which is fascinating. I mean, at first, just to acknowledge the spike in cases, 1.7 million here in the United States. I feel like just a few weeks ago, Jamal, I looked at it and it was like 1.3 million. So to see it shoot up over 2 weeks, some 300,000, it's just outrageous. Yeah. Outrageous to see how quickly it's growing, and to see the pool parties and the picnics and the celebrations this Memorial Day weekend. The irony that it's the day we celebrate fallen soldiers as we continue to kill ourselves, the living ones here in the United States.
Did you see that? Did you see those stories?
Yeah.
The number of people they were like out at the beaches and just hanging out. Astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, people can handle the social distancing and isolation but so long. Yeah. And it's just a bummer because they're like additional things you wish people would do, just wear a mask. I mean, we went through Baltimore to the Inner Harbor this weekend, and the majority of people did not have on masks. People were walking by. Drunk guy comes up to us as we're sitting there eating our lunch, starts yelling at us about how much we would pay to jump in the harbor. And you're saying to yourself, you're drunk and you're yelling at us 3 feet away. Like, clearly you're spitting at, like, get away. What's going on? And so we live in a kind of a bizarro world here in the United States. I just don't think people still really fully want to admit how bad it is here compared to the rest of the world. And this speaks to the fact that our public health system here in the United States is one that's not geared around prevention. And so preventing these diseases is not of interest. Instead, we all just want to get sick and then have to pay for it. But then it's geared around people actually getting sick because there's such a profit motive to it that there is no rush to cure this because people are making money off of it. And I think that's to your point, Jamal, is that the ruling class right now, the Jeff Bezos of the world, the billionaire class, and these senators who sold their stock, people are making money right now. It's not like the whole economy fell out and all of the money got taken off to another planet and it's gone. That money is still here amongst us. It's just who has it.
Yeah, 80% of stocks are held by the top 10% or something like that, or 10% of the population? I mean, that's exactly what it is. I saw those people going, and I think my point of view on this is slightly different from my own history, just from a history of having to deal with medical stuff. To me, there are things that you just have to deal with that intersect with your life. Not that you love it, not that you fancy it per se, but you don't necessarily always have a choice. Or you do have a choice, and the choice is just a grim choice that you don't necessarily make if you're a rational actor. I'm curious, before moving on to the other story, why do you think that stuff like this gets politicized? Because basically the mask issue became a political issue when really it's just a health issue. Like, what's the mechanism? What's the dynamic in our population where people look at a mask and say, you know what, that's a political statement, as opposed to, no, I just don't want to die?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. That's a lot to uncover right there. I mean, one, we've talked a lot about the show, and you bring it up a lot, is about just the individual nature of America, that how dare anybody tell me what to do. So if you're saying to people, hey, a mask is the best thing, hey, eat your vegetables, that's a good thing, people will say, hell no, I'm never going to eat vegetables. I mean, it's just absurd that there is just kind of this reactionary response to anything that comes from anybody that's not the American person. I think Donald Trump is obviously played politics with it. He saw a huge opening to go aggressively against China, and he wants to play up his response to the coronavirus. And so he's been very intentional of not wearing the mask. And every time he goes out not wearing a mask, it becomes a political statement. And then Joe Biden wears a mask. It's like, oh my God, which one of these two men are wearing masks and which ones aren't, which is the absurdity of our politics at this moment. I mean, I think of Andrew Yang in those debates where he was saying people were more interested in whether or not I was wearing a tie at the debate than anything I had to say. Yeah. And that's just kind of the American pop culture media and celebritization, that it comes down to what people are wearing. And in this situation, it's face masks that could save your life or at least prevent the spread of a deadly disease. But it's more about the fashion than it is about like substantive politics.
I think, that's terrifying. Because that has a root where our world is really screwed up, if that's true. I had a conversation with a gentleman who was talking about the Venus Foundation, and he was talking about it from a psychological standpoint, and he was making this difference between left wingers and right wingers, and how there's a brain chemistry thing that creates a difference between the two. It's not just that these people just have political opinions, even in the way that they deal with situations and the level of like hysteria that may be associated with it, the level of threat detection, all of those things tend to be somewhat different. That puts a certain point of view. But what that means is that even if you had the greatest policy on the planet, there will be a group of people who say, yeah, no, I got my liberties.
Well, I mean, look at climate change to go no farther when you have just
Perfect
basic
example.
policies like, hey, if you guys don't want to die. I mean, even like farmers I talked to when I was there in Iowa, they would simply brush it off as like, yeah, we hear you, but the stuff's cyclical. Our family's been here for centuries. We could tell you the weather back in 1907, and this is nothing new. Like, people will always find a way to justify it too, Jamal, that is even more dangerous than simply saying like, no, I disagree with you. But on top of it, they layer narratives on top of it that justify and entrench them in their position, and then they spread that information to other people. And that's what's really terrifying. It's not just simply how people act, it's how they act and then spread their action onto others.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. And speaking of reopening the economy, so the meat industry is trying to get back to normal during a pandemic, with numbers still continuing to spike. So the meat industry right now is giving us a pretty clear indication of what going back to normal too soon could look like. Earlier this month, President Donald Trump used the Defense Production Act to shield meatpacking industry from some legal responsibility as it pushed to be able to keep the plants open. Now, he didn't use the Defense Production Act in the way that people like myself and you on the show have been saying, of getting the equipment, getting the vaccines, getting the materials and the medicines, getting protective gear. Use that by pushing companies to do that. No, he decides to use it in order to shield corporations from legal liability. That's great. Now, according to the Washington Post report, cases at the biggest United States meat processing, Tyson Foods, have gone from 1,600 at the beginning of May to more than, wait for it, 7,000. 7,000. The explosion has occurred despite all the safety measures the company says it put into place. And of course, this tally comes from news reports and public records. We've already reported on how states and companies are deliberately obscuring outbreaks at meat packing plants, notably in Nebraska, where the governor earlier this month decided to stop sharing information about the cases at individual plants. A New York Times report on how meat processing workers are faring notes that the meat processors are simply refusing to share information about infections at plants, either with the media or with their staff. Springfield Foods, one of the nation's biggest meat processors, won't say how many people at one of his massive North Carolina plants are sick, and neither would the state health officials. Now, this puts you in the mind of the situation where you would take a picture or take a photo or video of these guys abusing either cows or other animals. And then instead of dealing with the plant that's abusing those cows and animals, they put through legislation to prevent people from actually taking video of it. It's kind of like cops also. It's like you record a cop killing or beating somebody, and the issue wasn't so much that the cop did it, but more so the fact that you showed it to the public. Quote unquote, meat companies have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on measures such as protective gear, paid leave, and ventilation systems since they were forced to shut down of plants that were among the coronavirus hotspots outside of urban areas, the Washington Post writes. Maybe if they put all of that money into this process and you still have numbers going from 1,600 at the beginning of the month to 7,000 now, perhaps they needed to be closed a little bit longer. Bob, this is bad, right? I mean, we're talking about like less than a month. Yeah. And these guys that went from 1,600 to 7,000, that's astonishing. And then Trump not using the Defense Production Act to force companies to make the equipment and the supplies that we needed going months ago. Months! No, he decides to use it to shield and protect corporations from legal liability. Astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, what's even more terrifying is the people that are making these decisions and hiding these numbers have so much power throughout society in really unique and interesting ways that it's really terrifying. I mean, when you think about somebody like Pete Ricketts there, the governor of Nebraska, hiding those numbers, his family owns the Chicago Cubs. It makes me so sad to say that as a beloved Cubs fan, but the Ricketts family owned the Chicago Cubs, Jamal, and there's a big conversation right now about whether or not players will be forced to come back to work if they're going to be threatened to not be paid. And you have this crazy, fascinating debate between billionaires who own the teams and then their millionaire employees. But clearly, the Ricketts family does not care about the well-being of the worker. They just want to make money. And so we'll see sports rush back to reopen and fans back in the stadium, which is going to lead to more outbreaks of COVID-19. You're going to see them making decisions around meat packing. And so it's amazing that a small minority, some 600 billionaires in the United States, I think, and I can be wrong on that number, but this small minority of people have such power in all aspects and spheres of our society, government, in culture, in society, that these people can do great damage. And I think we forget that the strength and the power that these people have and the fight that would be needing to be organized to try to take them down or at least push back on them.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, like we're talking about let's say 1,000 people. Let's be generous. Let's say 1,000 billionaires. And you think, well,
621 is I fact checked myself on the spot. 621 billionaires.
So it's like you have that tiny number of people on the planet Earth with 7 billion people, 8 billion people.
Yeah.
And that small body of human beings are making decisions. Now, understand what that means logically. If you have that small body of people who are making these decisions, who are they going to function towards? Are they going to function towards their best interests, meaning themselves, or are they going to function towards the best interests of the society? Well, we don't have to guess that. We can look around and tell exactly what that's going to be. These guys have every incentive in the world to have other people doing a job that can put their lives at risk in order to reap the profits from those other people doing that job and putting their lives at risk. I mean, 7,000 people are infected. They didn't have to do that. I mean, are you telling me that people can't go without meat for a little bit or maybe eat less meat as opposed to having somebody lose their grandmother or their father or their mom or whatever? I mean, that's astonishing that we're arguing like this where we're like, yeah, we got to open this place up, and we need to protect the people who are.
But Jamal, don't you? I guess this goes back to maybe the fact that a lot of people agree with these people, that these people are elected officials. They're in office because a lot of people support them, and they say, "Give me my damn burger. I don't care about that other person that I can't see. I don't care about the nurse at the doctor. I don't care about anybody but myself and my family." And I think that's so kind of ingrained in the American consciousness that it's like it's you against the world, the final frontier. You keep fighting no matter what. And if somebody else tries to take that from you, you fight back. And so it says, sorry, you can't have a burger. You just simply say, I'm going to fight back. You don't actually say like, oh, because then there's a worker on the other end that's also dying who has a family who does impact me. Like that next kind of calculus isn't in a lot of people's peripheral view.
It doesn't seem to be. I mean, it really does seem to be, I want mine. I don't care the consequences of anybody else. This kind of real individualistic culture in society that's being masked by this notion of exceptionalism, missing the point that that's a broken culture. Like when you're functioning in a way where you really only care about yourself and the people who are just closely around you, well, what does that mean when somebody else is on that, where you're at the worst edge of that? Meaning right now they're turning the mask thing into a culture issue. The mask thing is not a culture issue. You have people who are dying at much higher numbers than others. Blacks are dying, 3 times the rate of whites. You have a large number of people who are people of color, be it Hispanic or African Americans, that are losing their jobs at much higher numbers because, again, those are jobs that, the 95% of jobs that were created under Obama that were low-wage jobs. And now, it's like you have this argument of, shouldn't we care that this person makes $15 an hour to have a decent wage? Should we care that this person have health care? Should we care that that person is not drowning in debt? The catch is you should care, ideally, but in our case, we haven't cared for like 40 years. So now you're in the middle of a pandemic where it's like, why don't they care about doing this or that?
Because it's amazing too. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing too when you talk about like where does that leave our society and our politics. Right. It's been interesting here in Washington, D.C. is this hyper gentrification, which has left us to lead to building a lot of studio and 1-bedroom homes that are extremely expensive, that only cater to affluent young people that are moving to Washington, D.C., who are just going to live here for a certain amount of years and then leave. They have no interest in actually raising a family or having children. But yet then in our political space, we talk about public schools all the time, where you're saying simply there are going to be no kids left in these communities. Why even do public schools? And that really makes you start questioning, like, what are our priorities as a society? What are we going to contribute to together? And if you simply don't care about the well-being of people around you, the vast majority of your country's people who you'll never meet, but you don't even have a semblance of care, what's the point of having a society, Jamal? And I think there's a lot to unearth there. Unfortunately, we have left We are at the end of the hour, and we'll have to leave it there on that topic. I'm sure we'll come back and talk more about all of that and much more. We turn to our second hour here, where we'll look at a brand new documentary looking at the coal mining industry in West Virginia, Donald Trump's very unnecessary war posture against China, and Joe Rogan's big money podcast deal with Spotify. All of that and much more. You listen to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. We're back, brand new week of shows. We hope you are well rested there on Monday after the holiday. Hopefully too many of you didn't go out partying too hard over the Memorial Day weekend. Check your lungs over the next few days here. I know a lot of you were out not practicing social distancing. I won't tell anybody, but your doctor will tell you if you went too far, I'm sure. Tomorrow, we continue our show here, as I mentioned, talking about Donald Trump's relationship with China, Joe Rogan's major Spotify deal, shaking it up there in the podcast world, as well as some new polls coming out of Germany regarding people's thoughts on globalization. To talk about all of that and much more, we're joined by Tom Luongo, an independent analyst on politics, culture, and markets at his blog, Gold, Goats, and Guns. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Good afternoon, guys. How are you doing?
Good, good. Well, Tom, I thought we would be talking about the the rise of Justin Amash on the Libertarian ticket, but I think between the last time we had you on and today, he's no longer running, so we'll actually have to cover some serious news if that's all right with you.
That's fine. Honestly, Amash was not a serious subject.
I agree, and that's why we started with a nice opening joke there about Amash. Tom, I did want to start with a much more serious story here, and that is the intensified battle between Donald Trump and China over the last few months, as just it looked like the U.S. and China were seemingly moving towards better relations before the COVID-19 pandemic that seemingly has changed all future calculus. Well, Trump could have simply said as a key phrase here, hey, pandemics happen, China. We understand we're interconnected people. And if we want to respond properly to this threat, we must increase communication and dialogue between the U.S. and China. Well, of course, this is not what happened. Instead, Donald Trump tripled down on its attacks against China and has continued to fight against China at home and abroad. Tom, you had a few great new pieces on your blog, Gold, Goats, and Guns, titled, one piece titled, "Is Trump's New Cold War Necessary?" and another piece titled, quote, "Trump has won the propaganda war with China." I thought the articles both did a good job of breaking down the different forces pushing Trump's fight with China, that it's not just about the president, but it's a range of different forces pushing the current U.S. posture against China. Can you tell us a little bit more about those different forces?
Sure. So ultimately, what's going on here is that there's a much bigger fight. What Trump is doing is he's using the COVID-19 coronapocalypse, whatever you want to call it, as a convenient excuse to advance his agenda to decouple the U.S. and China from each other, which has been a focus of his administration from the moment he came into power. Right. This is nothing weird or new or anything like that. So, and the thing is here is that I see that the whole COVID-19 thing as a major ploy, a major shift a major opportunity by the better, for lack of a better term, the globalist elite, want to call them the Davos crowd, whatever, to remake Europe, remake the United States, and everything else, and Trump is caught in that. And I think China is willing to play into that, and so they have their influence in systems like WHO and others, and so Trump has used that long-standing relationship between the Democrats in the United States and the leadership in Europe on the European Commission, people like Angela Merkel and Macron and others, he's used that as a way to explain to his base and truly to explain to a majority of Americans that this is a relationship that needs to end and needs to fundamentally change because it's offensive, in his mind, un-American. And so that's the kind of a backdrop of it. And you understand that he wants to decouple the United States economy from China and bring back a lot of the economic incentives back onto these shores. So
you broke down a lot of those different forces, and the Gina Haspels and Mike Pompeo's have one thought towards China. You have the military generals here in the United States that are always playing geopolitics and always looking for a war to fight, those pushing back on the economic interests, trying to disrupt what China is doing around the world to push its One Belt, One Road policies. I'm curious who's prevailing right now. I mean, it's so muddied and it's so much fog right now of who is actually coming out ahead at this. It seems like Donald Trump, sure, he's winning on some political footings, and I think the rhetoric against China is playing well to his base, but I don't really see it as being the issue that he's going to win the election on. So I'm curious, out of all of those different forces, who right now is looking the best in pushing as the nefarious plans as they have? Who's doing the best pushing their plans forward?
I don't know at this point, to be honest with you, Bob. We're in the middle of the worst phase of it, to be honest with you. It's a good question, and I wish I could give you a clear answer. It's very obvious that Trump is trying to shift the United States in a different direction. And I'd also believe that this ties into Brexit a little bit as well. I just literally published a podcast about an hour ago discussing why the UK is a pivotal player in this as well. Because when you look at the situation in Hong Kong, the destabilization of Hong Kong began last summer over the extradition treaty or the extradition order signed by Hong Kong and China. And to me, the minute that started to spin up, it felt so much like a typical color revolution that we've seen in like Ukraine and Egypt and all around the world. Because it was very much a piggybacking on an organic uprising in Hong Kong that then was taken over by very professional NGO-backed forces, and it ballooned from there. COVID-19 kind of put that on the back burner for a few months, and then the Chinese now realize, I think, that the UK and the US have tried to destabilize Hong Kong, try to change the government there, and now they're pushing back again. And so I think Hong Kong is the pivotal battle in the war currently. Right? And whoever wins that war is going to be, whoever wins this for the soul of Hong Kong, I think is going to be able to state that they've won the latest round, as it were. And that may fundamentally shift the dynamic in Asia, because Hong Kong is so very important to everything. Right?
Yeah. Well, it's a major port there. It is a fascinating kind of who wins, and it seemingly is ultimately not going to be the Hong Kong people. It's the wealthy forces that are at play that are battling over the geopolitics of the world. They're going to determine who wins Hong Kong, and ultimately the people, whatever you think about them there, are going to be left out. I was also really impressed is the right word, but Mike Pompeo working extra hours here over the weekend and now bringing in other countries into the fight. And it's not just about U.S. and China, but they're really pulling in the peripheral actors here and making countries choose sides of this battle. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was on Australian television over the weekend and caused a bit of a kerfuffle. Tom Pompeo appeared not on a national broadcaster or one of the main TV channels in the country, but instead on Rupert Murdoch's Sky News channel on a show called Outsiders. On the show, Pompeo appeared to leave open the possibility of suspending some forms of information sharing with Australia, a member of the Five Eyes spying team, over the state of Victoria's possible future involvement with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. Pompeo's comments raised eyebrows in Canberra because of Australian government had moved earlier to block Chinese-owned Huawei and ZTE from Australia's 5G network in response to security advice, a decision made in 2018 and welcomed by the U.S. that Beijing still cites as a source of ongoing diplomatic tension. Tom, it's like a bad breakup where it's not enough for your friends to disavow your ex, but they must swear allegiance to helping you destroy their lives on top of it.
Oh yeah, no, it's very much part of the, again, by the way, Boris Johnson just said, we're going to review whether or not we're going to use Huawei's equipment in our 5G network now after after effectively signing a deal or saying that he was going to, and Trump was very disappointed in this. It's very clear here that the closer we get to the election, the more that Trump is going to ramp up the rhetoric and more that he's going to play this to the hilt, because I think he believes right now that his chances of re-election are very strong. And I think that Boris Johnson believes his chances of re-election are very strong. Otherwise, Johnson wouldn't have changed his stance on Huawei. I think that's a very interesting leading indicator. So because of those things, it's to me, it looks like if Trump is going to be able to get his way in the second term to radically change the dynamic between us and China. And yes, he is going in a sense scorched earth. And I wonder if he's been manipulated into this truly ramping up this rhetoric and ramping up his war against China. Whether he's been manipulated into that with having been given bad information about the source of COVID-19. I fundamentally believe that that's a possibility here, because he is such an emotional creature. And if he feels that, if he's been given information that makes it look like China was trying to kill Americans this way in a biowarfare tactic, and that's what he's been shown, then this is self-consistent with his previous behavior on these fronts. So, that's what worries me, because I don't see COVID-19 that way. I don't see it as, I don't see it as a nefarious lab leak or anything else. I just think it's something that, came up and we have to deal with, and, and blaming everybody for how they should be dealing with it is really specious, especially knowing full well, because Pedro Escobar talked about this, full well that the American government was briefed back in November about this virus. So, a lot of that anti-China rhetoric at that level and calling it the Chinese flu and all that, it just feels like pure propaganda to me.
Tom, I'm curious from your perspective on this. If widgets can be made in China for, let's say, 75% less than they could be made in the United States, is it not an unpardonable intrusion into our economic system for Donald Trump to take these actions towards China, even if it is trying to bring back those industries and businesses into the United States, using this virus to do it?
Yeah, I mean, my libertarian bona fides would say, of course, right? But we're at geopolitics level now, Joel. I'm not. My opinion on the matter is ultimately irrelevant. You at this point, we're not here to grind our ideological axis. If anything, we use our ideological filters to do analysis and then decide whose analysis is the best.
No, Tom. I'm not trying to get an ideological axe. When you're on the show, I always find, these are questions that I actually do want to know. Because I think there's an interesting space where things hit the margins. How do you make the determination between something that becomes geopolitical versus economic? I've heard plenty of people who are entirely looking at this from an economic standpoint say it is unpardonable for the U.S. government to intrude upon our economics in this way. If you can get a widget for, 50% less in China, then from an economic standpoint, you should get it made in China for 50% less. That's where I'm getting at. But this is not grinding an ideological axe. I'm just kind of curious on where you fall in on this, these kind of gray areas.
I don't think that we should be doing it. Well, there's two things here. I think that China's comparative advantage on a great number of things in terms of manufacturing are a function of dysfunction here domestically, right? Tax rates, regulation rates, expensive government, yada, yada, yada. Also tie that into all the central banking issues and everything else and all of that. America is expensive to do business in domestically, period. And for that reason, so it's and also to ask that question now after 150 or 200 years of the government fully intervening in our friggin' economic space, especially when it comes to strategically important assets like communications, energy, transportation, all of that stuff. The U.S. government has always been in charge of all that. They've never not been in charge of it in our lifetimes. So to ask that question at this point in time now, I mean, it's a good question we should ask philosophically, but pragmatically, we've been living under that regime our entire lives. So now we're just talking about, not in principle, but in kind, right? To what degree should they be involved, right? And that's So my ideologically, philosophically, I say no, of course not. Pragmatically, in the world that we live in, the world we got, like, what are we talking about here? An extra 2% of intervention by the government over what they were doing last month? I'm supposed to get outraged over this. I'm already outraged. I'm supposed to get more outraged? No, I'm not going to. So that's I fall on this. Okay.
Yeah. Interesting to talk about Donald Trump's posture in the U.S. Senate, not doing anything for easing tensions there between the United States and China. The U.S. Senate last week, as I think we talked about on the show, had delisted Chinese companies from the U.S. stock exchange if those Chinese companies don't let American regulators inspect the audits of its companies for several years in a row. The Chinese companies who have primary listings in the U.S. have an aggregate market capitalization around $1 trillion or 3.3% of the U.S. market. So there's going to be some major economic shifts. Jamal, I wanted to play this clip here from Donald Trump on attacking Joe Biden regarding his relationship with China, and then ask you a follow-up question from here. Here's this clip of Donald Trump attack ad on Biden.
Coronavirus infected millions, crushed the world economy. One nation deserves the blame, China. They lied about it, covered it up. Joe Biden coddles China. He criticized President Trump's travel ban, accused him of hysterical xenophobia. He voted for most favored nation status and spent decades letting them steal our jobs.
What a beautiful history we wrote together.
Joe Biden won't stand up to China. He never has. He never will.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
The J I heard stands for, I was going to say justice, but that's not even a funny joke. Jamal, I'm curious what this does for long-term relations between the American consumer and kind of to your point with the economy. In a recent poll that Tom included in his article from Bloomberg found that 78% of Americans are willing to spend more for products made in not China than in China.
Yeah.
Moreover, the poll goes on to say that 40% of Americans now say they won't buy anything at all from China. We live in a world that needs the world collectively to address climate change right now, and as well as to address the COVID-19. And basically, both our parties, Democrats and Republicans, and Donald Trump laying it on extremely thick, are telling us don't work with China. They're your enemy, when the solution to all of our problems is work with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's kind of true. I mean, there's an honest argument to be had in, look, the moment that we pass these trade deals, I mean, to speak to Tom's point, we end up passing trade deals. That's issues of law. And in passing those trade deals, we allow that stuff to go out the country and come back into the country without having any tariffs or anything else on those items, which basically, incentivizes our products to be made elsewhere. Well, that's an issue of policy. You know what I mean? And so the fact that, like you said, Tom, Joe Biden, or for this matter, Donald Trump, blaming and putting all of this at the feet of China, doesn't, seem to ring all that entirely true to me. But I am curious, do you think that Trump is winning this? Now, let me explain what I mean. Is this a conversation that Donald Trump, even if the country would agree that, yes, we think China has something to do with it, is the belief that China had something to do with it enough to absolve Donald Trump from blame in regards to either COVID-19, especially if the death toll continues to skyrocket? And that's for you, Tom.
I don't know, guys, because I don't necessarily agree with the statement about the extent of the pandemic here in America. You guys need to know that I'm on the opposite side of the fence when it comes to that. I think this is all terribly overblown. And neither here nor there. Do I think that absolves Donald Trump? We're going to find out. I think that Biden, that's all he has to run on, and that's all they're trying to. All the Democrats are trying to pin on Trump. They're trying to pin 40 million people out of work and the coronavirus on Donald Trump. And I don't know that that's going to work. And I'll be frank and honest with you. I think Trump's done a good enough job explaining the situation and reacting to the situation. And I think in trying to deflect a lot of the blame onto China, of course that's just politics. I listened to that ad you guys played. I'm just laughing the entire time, to be honest with you, because it's just so ludicrous and over the top. But then again, it is what it is. And we're going to see just as bad political attack ads from the Democrats on Trump. So I don't know. I think that at this point in time, the longer people, along with the Democrats and the blue state governors and whatnot, attempt to hold people back from getting on with their lives, I think far worse is going to be for them politically. I'm sorry. That's the way I see it.
Yeah.
And
Tom, no apologies here, man. This is Political Misfits, so your opinions fit in quite perfectly. A wide variety of commentators throughout our show. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. No apologies for your political beliefs here. Tom, I wanted to pivot and talk a little bit about how COVID-19, and I guess the current political moment is shifting the populace and their opinions towards globalization. I am somebody who believes that we should look to interconnect and globalize, not in a westernized Americana kind of way, but think critically about how we can collectively work as a planet to address our biggest needs. But in Germany, there is a new survey going out by Der Spiegel, who found that only 38% of those surveys stated that globalization was more of an opportunity, whereas 57% felt it was a risk. And this is in comparison to May 2017, just about 3 years ago, when 63% of those surveys saw globalization as an opportunity. Only 38% described it as risky. So those numbers have pretty much inverse. Supporters of the left, specifically the Linke Party and the Alternative for Germany on the right, those voters see globalization primarily as a risk. Only among the Free Democratic, the classical liberal party, do their supporters have a clear majority surveyed that still see it as an opportunity. Tom, the legacy of COVID-19 may be to accelerate the move towards nationalism, isolationism, and xenophobia on the right, but we also see the left also fighting for this space as well. How do you see this playing out in Germany, and what trends do you see in that country carrying beyond their own experience?
Germany is shifting right politically in this respect. They are. Angela Merkel's numbers are through the roof, and they're kind of scary that they're this good, because it's actually now allowed her all kinds of political cover to do some terrible things at the EU level for Germans. Because look, during a crisis, we've talked about this I think the last time I was on the show, that during a crisis, people tend to coalesce around the existing leaders, regardless of what they think of that leader before the crisis. So crises always benefit the sitting leader. This is why Merkel's CDU has gone from about 23 or 24% in the polls to around 38. Those are numbers they haven't seen in years, right? And similar things are happened for Giuseppe Conte in Italy and yada, yada, yada. So I don't know that we're not going to be looking at globalization as we defined it up until 3 months ago, I think is dead. Globalization into a multipolar world environment, as the Russians and the Chinese talk about it, I think is what's coming. And honestly, you asked earlier about Trump and whether he's winning this war, who's got the advantage or whatnot. I think everybody realizes that we're going to push that this multipolar world is coming, and Trump is one of the few people trying to hold the old order together, but he's doing it on his terms, which are actually accelerating the process of creating the multipolar world, because he's weaponized the dollar through sanctions, tariffs, aggressive activity, potential regime changes, and the rest of it, to raise the cost of using the dollar domestically. And once we're past the moment in time when the world is so biblically short dollars, because so much of world debt is denominated in dollars. Once we're past that moment, that's when the day of reckoning is going to come for the United States and to deal with its own fiscal imbalances, right? And so that's the way I see this playing out. It's going to be a very complicated thing. It's still going to be a global economy, because that cat's out of the bag. The question is, who dominates that global economy? And is any one country going to dominate it, or is it going to be a basket of currencies, yada, yada, yada? And that's the fight that's really going on right now. That's the big fight. That's the big one. All the other stuff is just tactics.
That's fascinating, especially when you're bringing up global currency. Like where you have all of these countries, you just put that currency in a bag as opposed to having the U.S. dominate that one currency. I totally agree with you on this, because I think the moment that the United States is putting sanctions on European leaders and then putting sanctions on, all of these like 30 countries around the globe or something to that effect, you isolate yourself. And those countries have every incentive in the world to get closer together, and also to be bothered by you using your economic influence and economic power in order to go beyond things that are geopolitical into the economic sphere. Like the Huawei thing, the Huawei deal for the standpoint of the UK, or the oil deal that was taking place, the pipeline deal in Germany and Russia. Same thing. The United States was taking fiscal or financial policy in order to make those countries and their sovereignty, or undermine the sovereignty of those countries, to make choices that were in their interests. What do you think that looks like after a while? I mean, the moment that the dollar is no longer the reserve currency, the United States, that's a day of reckoning, correct?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This comes, and what I've been arguing for 4 years now with Donald Trump, 3.5 years since he took office, is this very point, trying to explain this to MAGA on one side, Q-tards on the other, and members of the resistance, and I'm like explaining all of it to them. Like, look, whether you agree with Trump's stance on China, you agree about his being tough on Russia, or you agree on this or you agree on that, at the end of the day, he's accelerating the moment when people say, I don't want to use the dollar anymore, and understand that your entire lifestyle is underwritten and subsidized by dollar diplomacy. And if you're okay with that, that's fine. But then you're going to take a hit to your standard of living, which is fine. I'm willing to take that. I'm willing to take that hit. That doesn't bother me. But I just want everybody to have their eyes open as to what he's doing, because there is a way out of this that does not have to be confrontational. China and Russia and Iran have all stated this multiple times for years now, that, look, let's just come to the table, negotiate a different world order, and let's move on. And the United States refuses, and Europe to a lesser extent, because they're part of this whole process, it refuses to relinquish control. And that's just the way it is. And no one's going to relinquish control until they're forced to. And that's why I say Hong Kong is a very, very interesting petri dish, because it's a very, very important on this war. Okay?
You're listening to Tom Luongo of Gold Goats and Guns here with myself, Bob Schlehuber, and Jamarl Thomas on Political Misfits. I want to make one last hard pivot as we have about 5 minutes left with you, Tom. You were talking about dollar bills there. Joe Rogan has signed an exclusive streaming deal with Spotify, which will begin on September 1st. According to Wall Street Journal, the deal could amount to more than $100 million, a number that Rogan doesn't want to discuss, saying, quote, it feels gross, especially right now when people can't work. Well, Mr. Rogan, you could take that money and give it to those people, so don't worry. There are ways to feel less gross. News of last week's deal, which gave Spotify exclusive rights to the Joe Rogan Experience, sent the company's stock soaring. It added $1.7 billion to its market cap in 23 minutes. The musician and critic Ted Giora pointed out on Twitter that, quote, a musician would need to generate 23 billion streams on Spotify to earn what they are paying Joe Rogan for his podcast rights. Big payday for Rogan, big payday for Spotify, and a big middle finger to YouTube and iTunes. Tom, what did you make of this deal? Lots of independent podcasters have been frustrated with the censorship placed on them by Google and Apple over the last years in regards to media censorship. Does this deal ripple beyond Joe Rogan?
I think absolutely. I wrote an article called Joe Rogan Just Blew Up the Death Star. And if you listen to the Alex Jones video where he announced what Joe Rogan's intentions were, because he gave Alex Jones the media exclusive to explain his position and why he did this. And Rogan made it abundantly clear he's going to war against Google and the rest of them because he feels that they've become intolerable as gatekeepers of information. And the reality is that Joe's a very open-minded guy. I think he's great. I think he's a good normie leading indicator, for lack of a better term. He's a guy who a lot of very normal people. I don't consider myself a normal person. I consider myself 6 sigmas out on the political spectrum where I need to be in order to do my job, right? And so I think that the three of us together would be way away from the norm. So someone like Rogan is he's a huge wake-up call to those people saying, yeah, no, YouTube's really out of control, guys. Like, seriously. And I'm taking a stand here, and in a sense, so should you, and you really need to think about this as well. So it's a big moment culturally. It was like, to me, it's like Kanye West going to the White House, right? To black people that it's okay to like Donald Trump, and to cut across cultural barriers, and to cut across political barriers that are artificial, frankly.
Yeah. Jamarl, I'm curious what you make of the deal. We've talked before, the Progressive Soapbox. You can check out Political Misfits there daily, as well as some great content you put throughout the day, Jamarl, about leaving YouTube or Google. I'm curious, have you thought about $100 million exclusive deal with Spotify before? Maybe that would be a better home for the Progressive Soapbox platform.
No, I care about my audience too much to take that money like that. So, if Spotify wants to throw that out there, fair enough, but I'm against it. I'm sticking with my audience. That's kind of where I am with this. But I do say, yeah, I agree with Joe Rogan totally with the censorship stuff. That's massively problematic. The shutting down channels, be it Facebook, be it Twitter, we don't own our commons. And so it's like these things come up and we don't have the capability of protecting content in this way. These things are just owned by these kind of faceless organizations. Tom, what do you think is going to come of this? Do you think anything real, like from the standpoint of an exodus from the channel going further into some of these other networks? I mean, I think the problem is that those channels don't necessarily pay. But with Joe Rogan, is this going to be the start of something where people actually start to migrate or have a larger conversation in regards to what can we do in order to hedge our own best interests while working for these companies? How about 1 minute?
I think it does, because look, it's a killer app for Spotify, and Spotify's been the odd man out, and they're the ones that are getting their butts kicked in the marketplace. And so this gives them something, and it gives a wake-up call to a lot of people. And if Spotify doubles down on this aside from the fact that they're going to get more traffic and they're going to get more people looking for podcast-related material and stuff on their platform, and they're not just selling commodified music, which is a terrible business model, they can become the alternative node if they're willing to do that. Now, that's going to be the big question. So the big question is, are they going to become the home of, those who have been marginalized? And if they are, well, then that's great. And if they aren't, then it's going to be interesting to see what Rogan does 3 years from now.
With that, we're out of time. Tom Luongo from Gold, Goats, and Guns. Tom, you have a quite bit of a blog there. Can you tell our listeners where they can get more information about you and what's on your blog?
Sure. My blog is over at www.tomluongo.me. You can also find me on Twitter at TFL1728. You can follow me on Patreon. Support me there, Patreon.com/Gold, Goats, and Guns. I got a monthly newsletter that gives out portfolio advice, and I do twice weekly podcasts that are exclusive to my listeners over there, my patrons, where I do market analysis and news of the day.
Excellent. Tom, thank you again, Tom. So you're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
Tashawn, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas. Time for our weekly Politics of Art segment. This week, we take a look at the soon-to-be-released documentary film Hard Road of Hope. The film takes a look at the brutal and destructive history of coal mining in West Virginia and how narratives have been spun to allow for major corporations to destroy communities and the environment. Joining us to talk more about the new documentary Hard Road of Hope is writer, director, and producer Eleanor Goldfield. Eleanor, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Eleanor, amazing, first of all, to see this new piece, given how prolific you already are in the work you do as a creative activist, organizer, journalist, and co-host of the podcast Comment Censored, among numerous things. So it was amazing to see yet another piece of work out from you. I had the chance to catch a sneak preview of the film, which comes out in just a few days. I watched it over the weekend and absolutely loved it. It was an incredibly educational when it came to exploring labor rights in the U.S. It taught me more about the current environmental fights taking place just in my back door here, my backyard. And it gave me a lot to reflect on when it came to how the media and the government are complicit in pushing corporate narratives. Eleanor, tell us more about the film and what led you to this project.
Yeah, so I think one of the important things to point out here is that I wanted to change the perspective of West Virginia because West Virginia is so commonly used as like the butt end of jokes. I mean, I grew up in the South partially, and it really says something when North Carolina can kick down at West Virginia. So and I had never really been there. I didn't really know much about it except for what I heard about it, like, oh, it's just a bunch of hillbillies and rednecks, and it's an opioid state. It's just a bunch of right wingers and stuff like that. So I really wanted to see for myself. And what I found was twofold. Yes, West Virginia represents a microcosm of the sort of oppression and pain we see that's driven by corporate malfeasance in this country, but it's also a hotbed of radical resistance. And that's something that's not taught, definitely not on the national level, but even on the local level in West Virginia, they're completely amputated from their radical past. And so one of the things that I wanted to show in this film is that how we can really dig into our past and find inspiration for the future. And that's what folks are doing there. And so it felt important to me to uplift these stories, particularly at a time when I think a lot of people feel isolated, a lot of people feel alone, a lot of people feel forgotten by the government that they thought was going to be on their side in a crisis situation like we're seeing now. So I think it's a powerful storyline there and a powerful time to release it.
Yeah, and the storyline there, you talk about the history of labor rights and efforts to stop things like child labor. These things didn't just magically happen that all of a sudden they had stopped. There were long battles to win those rights. And it was amazing that you showed the journey of how West Virginia was even populated, how a lot of immigrants were marketed to at Ellis Island and brought to these eventually would become mining communities. But these people had so little, but yet they were able to organize and fight back. I mean, just thinking of like not having access to food and refrigerators or certain tools like that to be able to actually go out day after day after day and refuse your income in exchange for protesting and fighting back against these corporations. I thought that was a remarkable journey you took us on in the film.
Yeah, thank you. And a little tidbit of trivia for folks. The word redneck actually stems from those labor fights. And this really just speaks to how twisted the propaganda can become in support of the corporate state and in support of industry, as opposed to in support of labor rights and leftist theory and ideologies. The rednecks were indicative of the fact that mine workers, both black and white, tied on red bandanas, marched side by side, and even fired upon with guns members of the coal industry. And instead of getting hanged, they were given many of their demands. They were paid in real American money as opposed to coal industry money that they could only use at the company store. You know, folks might recognize that term from the songs. I sold my soul to the company store. That's a real thing. Mine workers used to only be paid in company money that they couldn't use anywhere else. So they were basically they were tied to this industry. And the mine wars, the Matewan massacre, the Battle of Blair Mountain, these were pivotal moments in the history of labor rights in this country, and they've been completely whitewashed and covered up so that people feel more connected to the industry than they do to their fellow workers.
Yeah, I wanted to also dig more into the human cost and environmental cost of coal mining, which I think you captured quite well in the film as well. And I wanted to start a little bit with the human cost. You covered the opioid crisis in West Virginia, but you also covered things I thought, well, when it came to the intrusion on people's day-to-day lives, just the noise level, for example, that many of these communities had to face when these mines would come in is just something I didn't even consider. Obviously, the views of when you move to a community that has a ton of trees and nature, and that's why you went there, and all of a sudden now the top of these mountains are completely ripped away by these huge machines. I also thought it was really amazing, the one interview you captured, which talked about how these corporations work to divide people, and the person you had interviewed in the film talked about how they work to isolate, exploit, and abuse individuals to ensure they wouldn't be able to organize together. Talk about what the actual human cost is through the mining industry.
Yeah, that's a great point to highlight, Bob, because one of the things that is so pivotal in organizing, as you know, as an organizer, is to bring communities together and to have communities relate to each other among solidarity lines of being part of the community. But if you have industries ripping communities apart, then you completely destroy the fabric, the foundation of organizing. And that's done very purposely. You know, that's a coal industry tactic that now is also a fracking industry tactic. And I mean, you mentioned the noise. That's also something that that's passed from coal to now fracking. You have these compression stations, which basically compress the gas to move it along the pipeline. These are horrifically noisy. I talked to a couple that had moved to West Virginia for the peace and quiet to be close to nature. And now, they have got trees dying. None of their chickens will lay eggs because it's just too noisy and they're too stressed. And this is outside of the environmental impact, the fact that, these people are experiencing health issues. Again, parts of their land is dying, and there's no real reason why, or they can't figure out why. Another example is a place in West Virginia called Prenter. 98% of the people who live there developed gallbladder disease because of leaks from coal chemicals into their water supply. 98%. And these, stories like these are all around West Virginia, and this really feeds the opioid epidemic, of which West Virginia holds the uncoveted first place of the most opioid deaths in the nation. And for a state that is the second most rural state in the nation, that's really breathtaking. And it really speaks to if you look at the research, the drivers of addiction, isolation and trauma, and these stressors where you feel like you're all alone, no one cares, there's no way out for you, there's no way up for you. And this is really something that the coal industry and now the fracking industry has really bared down on. You have no one but us, the cold, hard hand of the market, to rely on, and we only want you for your labor. And if you die at the age of 40 from black lung, oh, too bad. And if you don't, you won't get any health care or a pension. And so this kind of deep oppression only fuels the opioid epidemic. So it's important to also look at all of these things as connected issues and then, again, use these as places to connect the community to itself and to each other so that we can use these points to organize as well.
And let's make another connection, politics. So when the Republican, the person who was one of Donald Trump's people, came out and made the term human stock capital, and everybody got mad at him for it. And my point was, are you mad at it because it's correct, or are you mad at it because he said it? The reality of it is that is the way they consider human beings, just as capital or as, this kind of like herds in order to make us more profit. And so West Virginia is a perfect example of that. West Virginia was one of those states that basically powered the rest of this country. And right now they're, 48th in regards to poverty. And if I'm not mistaken, there's like a 25% poverty rate for children in West Virginia. You can correct me on the numbers, or you can fact check me on the numbers. It's been a while since I looked. But just to make the point that much more clear, why is it that with a poverty level to this extent and an opioid crisis to this extent, does many of these guys trend towards a Joe Manchin type or other Republicans?
Yeah, it's a good question on the face of it. The other point is that the Democrats have done no better. There are Democratic legislators in West Virginia, much like in Louisiana, who had a Democratic governor. And having spoken to some folks when I was down in Louisiana, they said, well, I just don't trust the Democrats. And I was like, hey, me neither. But let's talk about why you're veering right. But yeah, it's a good point. And I think in the film, one of the things that I also talk about or share via some of the folks in the film is that they've been, quote unquote, programmed for Trump. They've been, because of this amputation of their radical history, they've taken their identity to be synonymous with the identity of coal, to be synonymous with this destruction of planet and their own bodies for the profit of the coal industry. There's some sort of sick, twisted pride in dying young for coal. It makes you American. It makes you strong. And this is, you only have to drive through coal country to see the stereotypical image of the coal miner. The proud man, the proud, strong man with his face covered in soot. This is sort of pedestaled. And yet it's pedestaled in this really sick way, like, oh, this is, we're powering the country. Okay, but you're dying younger and you don't get any health care. They're stealing your pensions. They're allowed to do this. in bankruptcy court. This is something that's been allowed to go on, that coal companies can file for bankruptcy and then be let go of all of their pension and health care, what they owe their workers. I mean, it is absolutely twisted. And you bring up a great point that it's politics. And a lot of people say, I just am not into politics, which is another thing that's covered in the film when I interview a former coal miner. And he says, that's just the stupidest thing I've ever heard, because everything is political. But there's sort of disconnect that, again, there's a pride in not being into politics. You just go to work and you do your thing, and yet that makes you a proud worker. And this has shifted just in a couple of generations. I talked to a woman who said, if you said the word scab in front of my grandfather, he'd lose his mind. But nowadays, most folks don't even know what scab is. The idea of crossing the picket line, the idea of unionizing. These are things that have been stolen from people through extreme propaganda and brainwashing. So that's another thing that I highlight in the film, is that we need to reconnect people with their past and not just barge in there and say, hey, you're evil because you work at a coal mine. That's not how you make environmentalists, or that's not how you push progress. You push progress by meeting people where they're at and connecting these political issues, as you noted, and really speaking to the needs that people have and deconstructing this twisted relationship that people have with this destructive industry.
Yeah, and just to your point, Jamal, I mean, I think the Democratic Party talks as if they're the voice of the poor people, of the worker, and they aren't, because their policies don't actually change the material conditions, but they take that position and then they basically say, well, and Republicans don't care about these workers. They don't care about poor people. We're the party that cares about them, which is a great way to turn off anybody that's not sure if they're a Democrat or not. Basically, the Democratic Party is trying to morally shame you, even though they're not doing it, which is disgusting that people turn off of it. And so, Eleanor, I think it's so vitally important. Meeting people where they are in the political sphere is vital if we're going to change anything whatsoever. Eleanor, the other thing you did so well in this new film that's supposed to drop here in a couple days, Hard Road of Hope, is covering the environmental destruction because of the coal mining plants and what the industry is doing. Tell us a little bit more about the environmental destruction and what you learned through the filming of this new documentary.
Well, there's one moment where I go up to a place called Caperd Mountain, which is a place in West Virginia. It's a mountain that was saved from destruction, but from that mountaintop you can see other examples of mountaintop removal. And there's the clearing that you basically come to that they've dubbed Hell's Gate, because when you look out, it's just a decapitated mountain in front of you. And so one of the people in the film, Paul Corbett Brown, who's the president of Keepers of the Mountain, said basically that if you were to put in a line all of the mountains that have been destroyed by mountaintop removal, it would stretch from the White House to San Francisco, and it would be 3/4 of a mile wide. And that's absurd. It's hard to even consider that, but that's basically what's been happened since the advent of mountaintop removal, which is not even the traditional way of mining. They used to dig back into the mountain, and now they blow off the top of it because they have exhausted the digging direct into the mountain. It's a bit like fracking is the new way of getting oil and gas, because the typical way of getting to oil has already been exhausted. And mountaintop removal is extremely destructive. Basically, if you think of a mountain as an ecosystem, you're decapitating that ecosystem. It's the source of the headwaters for that mountain. Appalachia is also considered to be one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. And this level of destruction is, you can't even conceive of how destructive when you consider how many species we might just be destroying just by doing this kind of work. On top of that, you have a lot of waste products, for instance, coal slurry, which is the byproduct of washing coal that just gets dumped in unlined earth dams, basically these valleys in between mountains. And this coal slurry is incredibly toxic. It's filled with toxic chemicals, which they, of course, won't tell you what's in them because that's a quote-unquote trade secret that's protected. So we don't even really know what's in the water and the sludge that's dumped from the coal washing. And this is just left to rot in these coal slurries. And of course, that seeps into the groundwater. That seeps into the soil, so that the crops and everything are also extremely toxic. So the level of the ripple effect of just one demolition of a mountaintop is really even hard to conceive.
Yeah, and the film did such a great job of laying that out to understand how it's all interconnected. I also just want to plug the film for its high value around artistic creativity and poetry and how you phrase language within the film. I thought it was a really creative and unique way to do a documentary film where you weren't just taking a subject and telling us about it, but you were thinking creatively of how it was going to resonate with us and how we were going to take the lessons that you present back to our own home. So I highly, highly recommend it. We are unfortunately out of time with Eleanor Goldfield, the writer and producer of Hard Road of Hope. Eleanor, it comes out in a few days. Where can our listeners go to pre-order and learn more about the documentary?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Bob, and and Jamal, and thank you for highlighting this. Folks can pre-order it at hardroadofhope.com. There are trailers and more information there, and it comes out Friday, May 29th.
Fantastic. With that, we take a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schleehuber here with Jamal Thomas. We close our show out here with a few stories we wanted to fit in to make sure you didn't miss anything here on Tuesday, May 26th. Jamal Thomas, I'll let you pick here. Do you want to do dogs or bots?
Dogs. Let's do dogs.
All right. We get this dog story brought to you by our producer, Michelle Whitty. It sounds like she is at her wit's end at this one, Jamal. Michelle writes, a woman in Central Park over the weekend truly raised the bar for being offensive and criminal on multiple levels at once, simultaneously yelling at a man who requested she follow the law, making a false police report, and strangling her dog all at once. Is this boss level Karen? The woman was apparently walking with her dog off the leash in an area of Central Park known for gardening and bird watching and where the dogs are supposed to be leashed. The video then went viral on Twitter as it appears to show what happened just after a black man asked the white woman to leash her dog. She approaches him panting from a distance, asks him to stop filming her, threatens to call the cops and say an African-American man is threatening my life, and then does exactly that, putting on a big show of hysteria. She's also, for some reason, choking the hell out of the dog the whole time. The video went viral and the internet went after this woman, discovering where she worked. She works as a head of insurance investment solutions at Franklin Templeton, where she's now on leave. Countless voices chimed in to say how serious it was for a woman to call the police, claiming a black man was threatening her and saying that the claim amounted to an attempted assault or murder, given what we know about police violence towards black men.
Yes.
Internet sleuths also uncovered a bizarre history of accidents, I'm going to air quote, accidents involving her dog. She'd had the dog for about 2 years when the incident took place, and according to an Instagram account she made for the pup, in the 2 years the dog has been attacked by another dog, choked on something and needed CPR, nearly drowned it in a pond, and had a toenail ripped out while in the park. After people on the internet pointed out this strange number of accidents the poor Cocker Spaniel had in her care, she surrendered him back to the agency she adopted him from, and presumably she won't be given another one for a while. Michelle writes, I, producer Michelle, am absolutely diagnosing this as Munchausen syndrome by dog.
Munchausen. It's not
Munchausen.
Yeah, it's Munchausen syndrome.
I practiced for the last hour and a half just to make sure I said it right, and there enough. Munchausen syndrome by dog.
Yeah.
Anyways, Ms. Cooper apologized, said she was just scared because she was alone in the park. It was broad daylight, said she's now learned overnight, tomorrow, how privileged she is to see the police as protectors when so many other people don't. Seems like you need a poop bag to handle this apology.
That's horrible. That's horrible on so many levels. I mean, I saw her like yank the dog, so the dog is being strangled.
It's awful. Yeah.
And so it does sound like, look, I don't know anybody that's had a dog that has had that many injuries. We have 2 dogs, and that doesn't even fit. That there's no way that you could have that many injuries with a dog. I mean, how many mistakes can you happen, in this case? And are you just a horrible dog parent, or are you actually going a little bit further than being a horrible dog parent and coming up with excuses to explain all of these issues? And honestly, I take this as, with the history of African Americans in this country, and especially around the notion of cops, the last thing you should be doing is calling the cops on an African American as a white woman, saying this man is either harassing me or threatening me. That can be a death sentence in real terms. So, we just did the story the other day about the cops breaking into the person's house with a no-knock warrant and basically murdered the person that was in bed. No issue. Or, you could do these stories like every day. And so now you have a situation where she's calling and saying, hey, this black guy is screwing with me. Can you come in, help me? I'm curious, what's going to happen with her? It's illegal to file a police report. And if I was him, I would definitely be pressing charges.
I don't know. White woman in America seems like she could shed a few tears and they'll let her go, Jamar. Sadly, yeah, we'll see if there's any follow-up or fines. The man said he would accept her apology if it was genuine and sincere, but I don't know. He'll have to decide for himself. It's always interesting, too, with the dogless people out there. If your dog's not going to be on a leash, and if anybody comes up to you and says, put your dog on a leash, I think you just put your dog on a leash. Like, it is the law to have your dog leashed. As somebody who's been bitten by dogs, who's a little apprehensive towards it, I get that people want their dog to run free. And I think there's some degree of that being okay. But the fact that you would freak out and call the cops because somebody simply asked you to follow the law is pretty absurd. Jamar, there's another story I wanted to get to here over the weekend just to laugh at real quick. And I don't know if you even need to respond to it. But Foreign Policy magazine this weekend promoted an article over Twitter by writing, quote, President Trump has upended 4 decades of successful U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. It took them 3 writers, Hal Brand, Stephen Cook, and Kenneth Pollack, to come up with this absurd notion that somehow the U.S. has been successful foreign policy adventures there in the Middle East. The Middle East, well, hell, who knew it was our plan all along to destroy Iraq, create ISIS, murder just literally every single Yemeni there is for some reason, wipe Palestine from the map and kill its children, creating a revolving door of government in Lebanon. And that's not even including our 20-year war in Afghanistan. Michelle, our fantastic producer, well, that maybe is Central Asia, not the Middle East. That's the best we could come up with here. Don't blur the lines. Jamal, it's amazing that somehow people still sit and earnestly write about the success of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
Isn't that wild? I mean, we invaded a country on the pretext of a lie, and it killed 1 million Iraqis after doing that. I don't know how that's in any measure a success. We destroyed Libya to the point where, basically having this kind of shadow wars in Libya and Syria, where Libya, you can buy a black slave now for like $400. And in Syria, 500,000 people were killed in that conflict. And then even in Afghanistan, where you had the United States working with this idea of giving the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. And these guys end up being the people who hit us later on, using the weapons that we gave them to hit us later on. Like it's utterly astonishing, Mujahideen. I guess my point is, this doesn't look like a success to me. And if this is a success, what does failure look like?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jamal. We have 1 minute left here. I just wanted to hit this story because I thought it was quite funny, because we're back on the is it a bot or is it not question. Huffington Post reporting that Carnegie Mellon researchers think that nearly half of the 200 million COVID-19 tweets they recently looked at came from bots. Many are plugging false cures, peddling conspiracy theories, and clamoring for the U.S. to drop safety measures in order to reopen America. Jamal, the long story short is that the article quickly talks about how to blame Russia and Chinese state media, that they assume maybe half of these are coming from bots. and they just talk about Russia and China. And in a statement, somebody basically said, well, how do you know? And they go, well, we kind of can tell. It would just take a lot of research to actually figure out what exactly is happening. Let's not do that. Let's just say it was Russian and Chinese bots.
That's astonishing. That's our news. That's our media. Like, think about that. The media who ran with a conspiracy theory for 3 years is basically saying, well, Donald Trump wants to open the economy and the Russians are backing Trump, so the Russians are probably the ones who are doing this. What? So
and the fact too that like Donald Trump is pushing false conspiracies. You don't need Russian and Chinese bots. The guy literally said, shine a light on yourself, take hydroxychloroquine and maybe drink some disinfectant. Stop focusing on China and Russia. The problem is our own people here in the United States. And I promise you, plenty of corporations and political people have found ways to have their own bots that regurgitate and spread false news. Stop blaming the other. The enemy is here within the house. Jamal Thomas, we are unfortunately out of time today for Political Misfits. Big thank you to our guests, Eleanor Goldfield, Tom Luongo, and Kevin Zeese. As always, a big thank you to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team for keeping us live daily here on Radio Sputnik. Shout out, as always, to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, I appreciate you all joining us for the show 12 to 2. Today was a treatment day, so I'm dragging ass a bit. But like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks all. I see you guys probably later this evening. Thanks all.